In a quiet suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns stretched like perfect green carpets, a man known only to his neighbors as the quiet professional lived a life that seemed almost too ordinary. He jogged every morning, waved politely, and kept to himself. Few people knew what he really did, and fewer still could imagine the storm about to unfold. On a warm afternoon, a group of men wearing imitation uniforms and cheap plastic badges drove into the community. They claimed to be HOA police, a term that did not even exist in any legal handbook, yet they carried themselves with arrogant authority. Their target was one house, the black man who, to them, did not belong. They approached his property with clipboards and smug confidence, rehearsing lines of fabricated charges. But what they failed to realize was that the man inside was no ordinary homeowner. He was one of the most feared FBI agents in the country, a shadow operative whose work had toppled criminal empires and dismantled terror networks. What followed was not just an encounter, but a revelation that exposed the ugliness of racism and the strength of hidden power. The man's name was Elijah Cross. To the casual observer, he was a disciplined, private individual who moved into the neighborhood 3 years earlier. He rarely attended block parties or social gatherings, preferring the solitude of his home office, where files and case notes were scattered like puzzle pieces of a life lived in silence. His neighbors speculated endlessly. Some assumed he was a businessman working in finance. Others whispered about government ties, though no one dared to ask. Elijah had chosen this neighborhood for a reason. It represented stability, a place where his son could play basketball in the driveway without fear, and his wife could tend to her garden without the background noise of city chaos. He wanted peace. After decades in the shadows of federal work, tracking cartels, unraveling corruption, and dismantling organized crime syndicates, he longed for ordinary mornings and predictable routines. Yet ordinary was never something Elijah truly had. Even in his attempts at normalcy, subtle cracks of prejudice showed through. The stares he received while walking into upscale grocery stores. The murmurs at community meetings when his voice carried authority. The questioning of whether he belonged in a neighborhood where wealth and whiteness were silently equated with worth. He had grown used to it, choosing not to engage, believing his silence would shield his family, but in neighborhoods ruled by unwritten rules, silence often becomes ammunition for those looking to exploit it. The Homeowners Association had its board, a group of self-appointed enforcers who decided everything from lawn height to paint color. Some members used their positions as tools of control, masking prejudice behind regulations. Among them was a man named Gregory Tate. Gregory had lived in the community for over 20 years and believed himself to be the unspoken gatekeeper. When Elijah moved in, Gregory's comments about property value were less about landscaping and more about skin color. He watched Elijah's quiet strength with disdain, interpreting it as arrogance. Over time, he and a small group began to nurture the idea that Elijah needed to be put in his place. It began with subtle harassment. Letters slipped into Elijah's mailbox, unsigned but dripping with condescension. Complaints about noise, even though Elijah's house was silent most nights. Then came false reports to the HOA board, claims that Elijah was violating rules, parking incorrectly, or letting his grass grow too long. Elijah, unbothered, paid no mind. But Gregory grew more frustrated with each unreturned provocation. One evening, over drinks, Gregory hatched a plan with his friends. They would stage an inspection, pretending to act as enforcers of HOA policy. They called themselves HOA Police, a mocking title that gave them a sense of power. They ordered fake badges online, purchased imitation uniforms, and convinced themselves that their little act of intimidation would scare Elijah into submission. What they did not know was that Elijah had been trained to spot deception long before they learned to wear counterfeit authority. His career in the FBI had taught him that men like Gregory were often the most dangerous, not because of their weapons, but because of their unchecked arrogance. Still, Elijah did not anticipate that their fantasy would escalate into something reckless. On the morning of the incident, Elijah followed his routine. He jogged 2 miles before sunrise, returned home, and brewed a pot of coffee. His wife was away visiting her sister, and his teenage son was at basketball practice. Alone, he immersed himself in old case files, reviewing reports for a book he considered writing after retirement. His phone buzzed with encrypted alerts from colleagues, reminders that even in semi-retirement, his expertise was still requested. Meanwhile, Gregory and his group prepared. They gathered in a garage, slipping into uniforms and adjusting their plastic badges. They rehearsed their lines, laughing nervously but filled with a sense of superiority. To them, it was a game, a way to humiliate a man they deemed unworthy of their neighborhood. They piled into a truck and drove toward Elijah's home, unaware that their actions were about to collide with a reality far beyond their understanding. When the truck pulled up in front of Elijah's home, the neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Some whispered in approval, convinced that Elijah must have done something wrong to attract such attention. Others stayed silent, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge what appeared to be authority. In America, uniforms, real or fake, often silenced dissent. The men stepped out with forced confidence. They approached Elijah's door, knocking loudly, shouting claims of violations. "You are under HOA arrest," one of them barked, though the absurdity of the phrase was lost on them. Their voices carried through the neighborhood like a public performance designed to humiliate. Inside, Elijah paused. He had seen this kind of arrogance countless times, small men playing roles larger than themselves. But this was different. This was his home, his sanctuary, his safe space. He opened the door slowly, his eyes calm but observant. He scanned their uniforms, noting the inconsistencies, the flimsy badges, the nervous body language. He understood instantly what they were attempting, intimidation rooted in prejudice. Rather than confront them with anger, Elijah stood silently, letting their words tumble into the air. They accused him of violating rules, of failing to comply with regulations, of being disruptive to the community. Each claim was baseless, but each was spoken with a confidence designed to conceal their fear. The crowd of neighbors grew. Phones came out, recording the spectacle. Gregory smirked, believing victory was within reach. But Elijah knew something none of them did. Every second of this encounter was being documented through his home security system. Cameras hidden in the corners of his property captured every word, every gesture, every fabricated claim. As the minutes passed, the men grew bolder. One attempted to step inside Elijah's doorway, a violation not just of courtesy but of law. That was when Elijah's demeanor shifted. His voice, calm yet commanding, cut through their noise. He reminded them that trespassing was a criminal offense, and impersonating law enforcement carried federal consequences. His words, delivered with measured precision, unsettled them. They laughed nervously, but the cracks in their performance began to show. Gregory, however, doubled down. He accused Elijah of threatening the community, of being out of place. It was no longer about rules or lawns, it was about identity. His words dripped with racial undertones, exposing the truth behind the charade. The neighbors watching could hear it clearly, though many would later claim they hadn't. Elijah remained still, letting Gregory's venom reveal itself. He had spent years dismantling criminal operations, and he knew that sometimes the best weapon was silence. The more Gregory spoke, the deeper he buried himself. Elijah's patience was not weakness, it was strategy, but the men pushed further. They demanded Elijah step outside, insisting they had authority. They reached for his arm, attempting to pull him forward. And in that moment, Elijah revealed a glimpse of who he truly was. His movements were swift, controlled, and undeniably professional. He evaded their grasp effortlessly, his stance shifting into one of quiet dominance. The men froze, realizing suddenly that they were not dealing with an ordinary homeowner. Something in Elijah's eyes, the cold calculation, the unflinching calm, spoke of experience far beyond their imagination. Yet they did not retreat. Arrogance rarely allows retreat. Instead, they grew louder, shouting accusations meant to mask their fear. What they did not know was that Elijah had already activated a silent alert on his phone. Within minutes, unmarked federal vehicles were converging toward the neighborhood. Agents armed with real authority, real training, and real consequences were closing in. The stage was set for a collision between fantasy and reality. The sound of tires screeching against asphalt shattered the performance. Black SUVs rolled into the cul-de-sac, their presence commanding attention. Neighbors gasped, their phones trembling as they captured the scene. The fake HOA police stood frozen, their fabricated authority dissolving under the weight of real power. Doors swung open, and federal agents emerged with precision. Their movements were disciplined, their presence undeniable. They approached with calm efficiency, weapons holstered but authority radiating. Elijah stepped aside, allowing the truth to reveal itself. The agents identified themselves, presenting real badges that gleamed under the afternoon sun. They surrounded Gregory and his group, demanding identification. The men stuttered, fumbling with their plastic badges, their bravado collapsing into panic. The absurdity of their scheme was laid bare, exposed in front of the very neighbors they sought to impress. Gregory attempted to speak, his voice cracking under pressure. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, a joke taken too far. But the agents were unmoved. Impersonating law enforcement was not a joke, it was a federal crime. Trespassing, harassment, racial intimidation, each charge stacked higher, crushing the fragile illusion of control they once held, and then came the revelation. One of the agents turned to the crowd and spoke plainly. Elijah Cross was not a victim but one of the most decorated FBI agents in recent history. His work had dismantled cartels, infiltrated terror networks, and saved countless lives. The quiet man they underestimated was a figure feared in criminal circles nationwide. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The neighbors who once doubted him now saw him in a new light. But Elijah did not gloat. He stood silently, watching as the men who sought to humiliate him were placed in handcuffs. The power dynamic had reversed completely, and the truth was undeniable. As the SUVs pulled away with the imposters inside, the neighborhood fell into an uneasy silence. The spectacle had ended, but its impact lingered. People whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed. Some felt shame for their silence, others for their complicity. Elijah closed his door quietly, returning to his home as though nothing had happened. For him, this was not a victory but a reminder. Racism was not always loud. Sometimes it wore uniforms, carried clipboards, and knocked on doors with false authority. He knew that exposure did not erase prejudice, it merely shifted it into new forms. Yet his son would return that evening, and Elijah would face the difficult task of explaining what had happened. He would tell him that strength is not about retaliation but about discipline. That dignity in the face of hate is itself a form of resistance. That the truth, though sometimes hidden, eventually speaks louder than lies. The community, too, would wrestle with its reflection. Neighbors who had stood silent were forced to question their choices. Why had they believed the uniform so quickly? Why had they assumed Elijah was guilty without evidence? The incident became a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about bias and complicity. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. News outlets reported on the absurdity of fake HOA police and the shocking twist of their target's identity. Social media amplified the story, turning it into a national conversation. Some laughed at the foolishness of the imposters, but others recognized the deeper lesson, that prejudice, when unchecked, breeds dangerous delusions. Elijah, however, returned to his quiet routines. He continued jogging in the mornings, waving politely, living with the same quiet strength as before. But those who looked closely could see a change, not in him, but in how others saw him. Respect replaced suspicion. Silence turned into hesitant greetings. Yet Elijah knew respect rooted in fear was fragile. True change required more than exposure, it required reflection. The incident became more than a local scandal, it became a story of resilience, dignity, and the confrontation of hidden prejudice. It asked a question that lingered long after the headlines faded. How many others face false authority every day without the power to expose it? The answer remained uncomfortable. But the story of Elijah Cross stood as a reminder that racism, no matter how it disguises itself, cannot withstand the light of truth.